So I was talking to Lennon McCarthy on Twitter, and like we sometimes do, we were complaining about the leftist psychology and the bad behavior that it leads to. And he says that they've got a fascist style cultural network, I guess, on the left in which the elites tell the people at the bottom what to do, and they swallow it hook, line, and sinker and just go around. They get their marching orders and they march. And I said that they're bipolar because when things are going their way, they are extremely happy, and when things aren't going their way, they go nuts and start crying or burning shit down. So I think we're probably both right. We're talking about two different things, but I don't see any reason why they're incompatible, and I believe both of them. So I thought I could give a good example of this happening in practice, at least the Lennon McCarthy stuff about them having this top-down approach, by talking about Lee Stranahan and the Twin Falls rape case. If you don't already know about this, there was a 5-year-old white girl, a little white girl in Twin Falls, Idaho, who I think had some mentally challenged, some issues she had, and she was raped by 3 resettled refugees. So that's what the United States government and the globalists and all the people who run our country have been doing, is taking people from overseas who don't share our cultural values, who don't speak English, who basically don't have anything in common with most of Americans. They don't have anything culturally, like they don't know the Constitution. They didn't grow up in a country that had constitutional values or any of that kind of stuff. So they're completely different than Americans, and they want to take them and resettle them in different places like Twin Falls, Idaho, or if you know Sticks, Texas and Hammer, they were going to resettle 300 refugees in his town, Syrians in that case. But anyhow, back to the issue at hand. 3 of these refugees, 2 of whom were Sudanese and 1 of whom was Iraqi, got this little girl alone and raped her. And the media and the local authorities played it down and said that it was merely an assault or an event, but her parents say that she was raped. That she was stripped naked and raped and urinated on. So this story, because it didn't get like a good, thorough, complete airing in public, it was kind of like bits and pieces. People like Lee Stranahan were out there working on it. But since the case involved juveniles, all that stuff is sealed, so you can't really get unambiguous stuff on it. And if the local authorities are covering it up at all, then you're in a really tight spot. So what he did was talk to the parents of the girl who was raped, and now he's putting a lot of that stuff out there for public consumption, because the New York Times wrote this hit piece to say that the whole thing was fake news and that people like Stranahan are anti-immigrant, right-wing conspiracy theorist white supremacists, and they're just trying to give refugees and non-white people a bad name, and that this wasn't a rape, and it's all blown out of proportion. So that's what the New York Times did. Now it is dishonest what they did, and you can okay. So Lennon McCarthy said that the left gets their orders from the top, like fascist networks, and it's true. If you look at the people on Twitter who were talking about this story, especially the ones who were calling Stranahan a fraud, what they do is they say, this New York Times article proves you're a fraud. And then if you ask them specifically and say, what in that story is factually, wrong? Like, what are they pointing out about him or his work that was wrong? They can't tell you. They don't respond. They have no specific points that you then can look into for yourself and see if they've got good evidence or bad evidence for saying that he's a fraud. They just say, well, look at the entire story. The entire story is filled with stuff. And what that tells you is they're getting a signal. They're getting the idea, whatever they're supposed to believe, is coming from the New York Times. They're swallowing it hook, line, and sinker. and then they're regurgitating it to other people. And they're so slimy and slippery, there's nothing you can grab onto. So consequently, there's basically no kind of debate that you can have with them, and then they just ignore you if you pursue them and say, look, I want something specific. Give me something we can talk about here. Rather than you're a fraud, I'm a fraud, you're a fraud, I'm a fraud, and then nobody gets anywhere with it. The facts of the case are that the little 5-year-old white girl was sexually assaulted and raped by the immigrants. So Stranahan made a good point when he said the kind of mumbo jumbo that they do is they say, well, you guys said that the children that raped this little girl were Syrian refugees, and they weren't. It's all fake news. Well, who gives a shit if they're Syrian or Sudanese, right? I mean, to me, it doesn't matter, and I don't know why it would matter to anyone else. The point is, they really were refugees who the globalist people in the government just decided to, move in and resettle in various parts of the country. Certainly wasn't in those counties around Washington, D.C., or it wasn't in gated communities in Hollywood, right? They just ship them all over the country where there's middle class and lower class white people and say, you guys deal with them. And any fallout that happens, you'll just have to deal with that. Another issue that the New York Times completely screwed up, or what they mess with, is like one of the kids was 9, one was 10, and one was 14, I think. So they'll try to emphasize the fact that the youngest one was 9, and then they'll leave the 10 and 14-year-old part out of it completely. Or they'll imply that no rape occurred because no one was convicted of rape. But if you know anything about criminal justice or how criminal court cases work, you know that the DA starts off by charging, or the police officer and the DA start off by charging you with something like rape, and eventually it gets pled down to a lesser crime. But that doesn't have anything to do with the facts. It doesn't mean that there was not a rape. The New York Times article didn't really put up front the fact that the child was urinated on, which is like a clear message that these Syrian, or not, fake news, that these Sudanese and Iraqi kids had disdain for this little girl that they were sexually abusing. Because if they told you that, if they told you that they had urinated on the girl, then you wouldn't really have any sympathy for them, because you would already know where their minds and their hearts were, right? And since the New York Times is committed to defending refugees from all over the world rather than white people or American citizens, whichever it happens to be, they can't tell you stuff like that. So basically, they're playing fast and loose with the facts in order to create a particular idea, which is exactly what they accused Stranahan of doing. This is how the left operates. They've got goals they want to accomplish, but they have no principles whatsoever. So anything that they need to do to accomplish the goals that they set out for themselves, that's what they're going to do. If you think that I'm overstating the case there, I refer you to Eugene Puryear's radio show on Sputnik, which is called By Any Means Necessary. He's a black socialist, and when they say by any means necessary, they really mean it. I mean, they'll burn your house down or kill people or take hostages or torture or mass rape, because socialists think that because they have the greater good of the society or the human race in mind, that basically they can do anything it takes to get to whatever ridiculous utopia that they've got in mind. Okay, so this was my attempt to try to bring together the thing that Lennon McCarthy was talking about, which is that the leftists get their orders from the top, and they don't have much independent thought, and they don't have a lot of dissension. I think all that stuff's true, and you can see it by looking specifically at the way that the New York Times and its readers have been attacking Stranahan's journalism about the Twin Falls rape case. Thank you for your time.